Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you enjoyed your Christmas, and we are back to live streaming again. Anyway, rejoining us is Dr. Philip Blood to talk about how we can assess and analyze the Waffen SS. Now, as a caveat, before we get into the content, we all know the SS or Waffen SS represents the very worst of the Third Reich's ideology, which we naturally despise, of course, and their role in the war is synonymous with atrocities and war crimes. But nevertheless, how can we examine their combat abilities? And so with that sort of caveat done, we're going to be looking at their military history today. Dr. Philip Blood has already talked about the origins of the SS and how it works. Now we're going to just analyze them as a military force. I'll bring Phil in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Evening, Woody. Evening, everybody. Hope you had a great Christmas.
So there we are. I've said it in the caveat there. We're looking at them as a military force, and whether of course, we don't approve of their actions, but they were involved in some of the most notable campaigns in World War II, and there's sort of a mystique about them. It's we were talking about it on the Christmas show. It's the books with black and silver printing and runes and emblems. There's something that seems to draw the military enthusiast to them. But what we want to do with you is kind of just analyze how they actually performed. What was their combat prowess like? So you've come armed with a PowerPoint. So just tell me when to nudge on the slides, and I will do that. Folks, fire away with your questions and comments. I'll put some of them up on screen. We'll try and deal with some of them, but you know what it is with Phil. The most of the subjects you will ask about will be coming up anyway. But I'll hand over to my guest now to let's look at the fighting prowess of the Waffen SS.
Okay, so my other caveat with this is I've kind of focused on the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. The reason for that is I actually wrote a manuscript, I think I discussed it in the previous talk we had, that Richard Holmes, my supervisor, thought it wasn't advisable then to publish because of what had been happening with David Reynolds, or Mike Reynolds, sorry, and all of that silver and red, as you said, bordered books. And also, I wasn't approaching the subject in the same way. Reynolds and all of those chaps were all into the fighting elite and all of that, those kind of concepts, whereas I don't really deal with elite in the sense that to me you want to have a look at the fighting formation and see how it achieves and what its capabilities were, what its performances were like, and what was its culture that was driving its activities. And okay, in the manuscript, I set 3 questions, which is how can we assess the fighting power of the Waffen SS? Did the Waffen SS create a unique fighting culture, which of course everybody who writes about them seems to suggest that they do have that. And were they ordinary soldiers in the sense that Ardennes and many others thought of them when they were in combat? And that's a tenuous question because sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But if we can just move on. So fighting power comes from Martin van Creveld, who's an American historian who wrote a comparative study of the Germans and the Americans from the perspective of the Second World War. And he was kind of dismissive of the capability of the Americans while suggesting the Germans were rigid but somewhat better fighters. He's more of that, what I would call the Auftragstaktik school, which, as you know, I'm not convinced with. So his view of fighting power is it's a sum of the total of mental qualities that make armies fight. I prefer to use something I heard recently on the podcast, The Unconditional Soldier, where Colin Ferguson was talking about the way the British Army performed, and David Montgomery was his guest, and David Montgomery came up with the comment, the focused application of violence, which I've now nicked, so to speak, and added it to my research. So if we go on to the next one. So I know when I did the SS paper and the leadership, people were asking, how can somebody who does business work in the field of military history and military culture? What I would like to just point out is that I started at Lancaster University in 1978, and the people I was taught by was John Gooch, Martin Edmonds, and then later I did my PhD, obviously Richard Holmes and Chris Bellamy. And in those near on 30 years of academic study, this book came from the work that they produced. So, John Gooch's Armies in Europe, Martin Edmonds, Civil Military Relations Specialist, talked about armed services in society. Richard Holmes, Acts of Men in War. And of course, with Chris Bellamy, there is the doctrines of war and how land warfare evolved. And so I never came to this subject from the perspective of the Reynolds, the apologists of the Waffen SS. I came from it from a military perspective. Now, just for a second, I'd like to just pick up the surviving Waffen SS members around in the 1990s when I was writing this. And I think you can basically see just very, very faded. One says we were soldiers just like simple soldiers. And another one says we spent all our time at the front, we were fighting troops. And here's 5 of them in their old age, giving account of themselves of what it was like to fight at the Battle of Kursk, going back to the Battle of Kursk site. I found that working with the memories of those guys was very difficult, because basically trying to match them to their activities just didn't always work. And obviously, if you had a conversation with some of them, and I met the first one in 1980, you would start by saying, well, what was it like to fight the Russians? And the next thing it was, if the West had gone on our side and we'd fought in the great anti-Bolshevik crusade, we wouldn't be in a Cold War now. And those kind of conversations always threaded through. So although I've got many notes of meeting with former SS men, they are actually quite useless, really, for what I'm trying to achieve. I'm not talking about others, but what I'm trying to achieve is a proper analysis of the fighting power of the Waffen SS, and in particular this division. So if we move on. So from my previous slides, I just want to reawaken the old SS mission, the 5 points there, which was in the previous one. I don't think we need to linger. So if we just move on. And again, from that one, the takeover of power, the emergence of the SS, the black uniform, the black caps and the brown tunics, that meeting between the Nazi Party brown shirts and the emergence of an SS band as a bodyguard to Adolf Hitler, and mostly as a security force, but really street fighters and street fighter politics. So bully boys in uniforms supporting the Führer wherever he was going. So if we move on, central to all of this was the famous Blutfahne, which is the banner that was soaked in blood during the Munich Putsch of 1923. The bearer of this flag was Jacob Grimminger, who was initially a Sturmabteilung man in his brown uniform, shifted over to the SS. The importance of this banner was all the other banners were draped into the Blutfahne. And what you have is this connection with the blood. So it's not just the links between social Darwinism and that kind of idea of survival of the fittest, but you've actually got the Nazis who have actually confronted the state, have been killed to the greater sacrifice of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and that legacy must be carried on. So if we move on. So the SS in the early days in the 30s, when they were rising and their uniforms becoming more and more fanciful, they're given banners, and it's this kind of linkage with a pseudo-Roman Empire style. People might remember that in about 1890, the great Mommsen had written The History of Rome. So there was this deep fascination in German military circles for how the German military system was functioning, and links with empire and all of that kind of thing. So you get these eagles and the Nazi banners and the swastikas. Always round about the 9th of, always definitely on the 9th of November, which was an important date for many, many reasons, but we won't linger. Go on. The Waffen SS oath, again, it's people don't really contemplate the importance of this oath, but at the time it was regarded as something like a blood oath.
Yeah.
You're basically giving up your life for Hitler. And I vow you and to the superiors appointed by you obedience unto death. That's the important thing about the Leibstandarte. This
Have any other nations gone anywhere near that kind of simplistic way of complete and utter loyalty?
Well, I suppose the companions to Alexander the Great, I suppose the Imperial Guard to Napoleon, that there is, but not quite to the extent that when you're doing that, when you're taking that oath, you're putting your hand on a flag which has been had some kind of connection with the blood banner, and so it's a blood cult, and it's the blood cult which is within the SS. This isn't for everybody, or it wasn't in the 1930s. This was for a select group who were protective to Hitler and to the Nazi Party. So it's not really for outsiders as such. Anyway, shall we move? I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible. So as you can see, that's their barracks in Berlin-Lichterfelde. A little bit later, you can see them taking the oath on the banner. That banner is a Leibstandarte banner, and they've got the hand on the flag banner. And of course, the usual thing that we know of them as guards, similar to I suppose, the British Guards standing outside the palace, in this case, the Reichschancellery, ceremonial duties. John Keegan famously called them asphalt soldiers, which to a certain extent they were, but that's going to change as we continue. So if we just move on a bit. So here's one of the things which people talk about but really find very difficult to grasp, and that's the Führerprinzip. I'm not going into all the definitions and all the rights, but basically we're talking about a Nazi political doctrine which assumes the Führer is always right, the Führer's word is above the law, and the Führer is the supreme judge of the German people. Now, in the Führer principle, whoever becomes a leader of a group of men, he will get the same following, the same leadership support. So this is where the SS operate very differently, and why the idea that they would be running around with Auftragstaktik is just a complete nonsense, because they're not going to operate like an officer passing the orders down the line to an NCO and hoping he will do it. These guys, once they're determined to be leaders or designated leaders, they lead from the front. And it's an incredibly dangerous process, obviously, in war, when you're sticking your head out and you're running in front of everybody else. But that's what being a Waffen SS leader is about. So you're totally opposed to that Auftragstaktik. Now, I'm going to take a quick glass of Dudar. Excuse me. So, how does it transform? Well, here's an interesting thing. On the right side, you've got the two transformations, first from the mobile detachment up to 1937, and the first shift, the second transformation, the first shift to armored reconnaissance operations as a mobile couple of battalions, regiment level, still kind of like a bodyguard, but slowly growing, pushing I suppose you would say pushing the envelope. Now, in this film from 1940 to 41, the only time the SS are shown are these two pictures to the left, which is as Hitler arrives at the Olympic Games in 1936. You can see the SS men spilling out, getting ready to escort him. And as you can see, when they escort him, even when a child runs up with some flowers, they are there ready. And they do the same thing every time. So there is these procedures, they're motorized troops, they're fast. And to a certain extent, that street from street fighter to street bodyguard drivers on the cavalcades, the motorcade, sorry, to then the mobile detachments and then the military reconnaissance troops. They're easy transformations. That's an easy process. It's not a big leap. The big leap is the fact that they're now being trained to operate militarily, not just politically. Okay, so if we move on to the next one. Now, at the same time that the Leibstandarte is developing, Goering is pushing his guard, which are the General Goering Police Regiment, which basically, when the SS and the police combined in 1936, he withdrew his own personal regiment of policemen and pushed them into the Luftwaffe, and they became the Hermann Goering Panzer Division. Now, on the right is the Hitler Escort Battalion, and of course we talked about that with Rommel, but you can see the German soldier, member of the German army, but carrying the banner of the escort to Hitler, and you can see it's got the, I suppose, the almost imperial badges of the Nazi Party with the imperial eagles of the Wehrmacht. So if we move on. Now, if we leap, 6 years, you can see there is a political transformation. These are basically organizational charts, very kindly given to me by Niels Henkemann. They are there to show that these two small regiments from the 1930s had literally grown to become panzer corps. And so we're talking here of something which is basically the Nazi doctrine of militarism based on the panzer. It's like they, to begin with, it was the aircraft, the Stukas and the tanks and mobile infantry. But by the end, when the Luftwaffe has somewhat been drained of its resources, the two hard forces are these panzer corps, and of course the German army has one as well, the Großdeutschland, and they're symbolic of the new Nazism and the new militarism that emerges from 1942 with the onset of the failure at Stalingrad and a complete shift in Nazi military strategy. So if we move on, so the first time the Leibstandarte is committed, the first time is in Sudetenland and Prague in 1939, and then later in Poland. And here's one of the motorcycle detachments being greeted by Hitler and inspected. Now, the important thing here is there's still that strong link between Hitler in the field, because he goes out sometimes, and the detachments serving in the field. And okay, between the 17th, between the 1st of September and the 27th of September 1939, the 1st SS shifts between the 4th Panzer Division and the 17th Panzer Division. And during that time, it's really kind of shielded from making too much decision. So its commander, Seps Dietrich, doesn't have to do anything far too very complicated. All he's got to do is go out and operate as an armored reconnaissance unit. And if we move on, you can see the progress of the 1st SS, basically from Breslau, which is now in Wrocław in Poland. It doesn't look very far. That distance is about 3.5 hours, 4 hours today. It took them 27 days. They had some periods where there was rapid movement, and then they hit two difficult obstacles. So if we move on, the first one was on the 15th at Sochajuv, where this rapid armored reconnaissance unit suddenly hit resistance and started to take casualties. And as you can see, Dietrich's very quick to take cover. There were, as always with the 1st SS and Adolf Hitler Leibstandarte, there's always cameramen around taking pictures. Hence why there's photographs of all of their actions. And if we move on, this is the modeling fortress where the Leibstandarte and various Wehrmacht units fought the Poles to a standstill. It was a fairly long siege, given some hard fighting that was taking place at that time. Point is, I put these in here to show you that the fortress is still around, and there's still evidence of the fighting. Whether it was from the fighting in 1939 or whether it was from later in 44, it's unclear. But the fortress is there, and it's one of those sites where there is still a link with the Leibstandarte.
And at this point, Phil, in Poland, what do the other branches of the German military think of the SS at this point? The Waffen SS, do they have any kind of thought about them at all? Are they keeping them to themselves? Is there, the regular Heer units, Luftwaffe units? What's the score going on at that point?
Well, if you think that Rommel is escorting Hitler, and this unit, which is supposed to be Hitler's bodyguard, is running around in the field, most of the German units and most of the German soldiers at that time who recalled that activity were not greatly impressed with them. There was some evidence that they knew how to be soldiers, but there was also amateur behavior, which many of the German soldiers found incorrect behavior in the field. And to a certain extent, there was a view that because Hitler had said there would never be another army after the SR had been destroyed in 1934, the thinking was, well, okay, they're Hitler's guards, they've got to get some piece of the action, let them get on with it, but it's the army which is the superior fighting force.
Okay, thanks.
France 1940, again, they cover a lot of ground. They've been increased slightly to a regimental level. We know they've caused incidents, war crimes at Vermouth, but the actual activity of them is interesting. There's still these fast troops driving in vehicles which enable them to have some flexibility. They do follow the roads rather than going cross country. You can see this picture. This is the 3rd Battalion of the regiment, their headquarters detachment. There's a mix there of uniforms, coats, and motorcycle gear, because they literally jump on their bikes. Even in those days, Panzermeier would jump on a motorcycle and go off and be at the front of the fight. They did sustain certain amount of losses, but remarkably enough, they suffered the same losses in virtually the same losses in France they did in Poland. I think it was a harder fight in France for them because they got involved in Rotterdam and then went down to Dunkirk and then went to the south of France. So they covered a lot more ground. There was a lot more fighting. But it's hard to say that they were learning anything. Some people suggest that maybe they're still in that phase where there's this euphoria of victory, and okay, they make mistakes, but because the German army is winning its battles, those mistakes get sidelined and they don't really rise to the front. So July 1940, Hitler gives the Leibstandarte a new banner, which is on the left, and on the right, from the previous talk, we find the process of now recruiting SS men into the division and other parts of the SS organization suddenly expanded. So they're no longer just looking for a certain group of individuals, a certain class of person to come in and join maybe 3 units. Now there's as Himmler has this idea to expand, you see proper documents which go out to the public offering careers in the SS. So if we move on, and the 3 careers really are, to a certain extent, are the ordinary SS man, the NCO, the Unterführer, and then the leader, the Führer. Now these ranks, they actually reflect the kind of structure that's still in operation with the early Waffen SS units, whereas the officers are the men with the power. The personnel, the Sturmmen, the ordinary private soldiers, if you like, they don't have much to say but be cannon fodder. The NCOs, I find it very difficult to understand the NCOs. I'll discuss a lot more about it when I talk about the Allied interrogations of Waffen SS personnel. They also found the NCOs to not be of the same quality in terms of capability as the German army. Now, the German army, the NCOs were the backbone. They're the men who kept the units fighting and organized. In the Waffen SS, they're more inclined to be making sure that everybody's behaving correctly. And when I say that they're not saying that Hitler's an idiot. They're making sure that the correct things are being said and done. They're more of a internal discipline role than actual fighting. Not all of them, but on the whole, that's kind of their primary function. So if we move on. So the Leibstandarte is committed to interestingly enough, where the fighting's taking place today in Ukraine. They went from the south, running virtually along Kiev and Kharkiv, down to Donetsk. But what you also find is that while on the one hand, they're still performing as this fast troops, which is why you've got this picture of crowded motor vehicles trying to get down a road, there's a new image coming out of an ordinary soldier. And as you can see, they don't have any rank structure. They don't have any identifying marks. They're just men in camouflage smocks with their machine guns, looking like fighters. Now, that's not the same image that they had in the past. That's not their story. In the story before, it's been, we show our badges, we show our medals. These guys look more like modern soldiers.
And is their speed sometimes a masking their maybe lack of actual combat ability? I'm going to use a really crass sporting analogy, but those players that come along that are really fast but have no end product, is it kind of covering up some imitations somewhere because they're fast moving?
To a certain extent, they're covering a lot of ground but not doing anything.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Headless chicken.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. I think what actually happens in 1940 in France, they're able to move ahead, but never get behind the troops moving south. It's interesting. You'd think that with the remains of the British Army that was moving south towards Saint-Nazaire, with the French troops covering the line, you'd think that many of these these fast-moving German units were getting behind the French and British, but they weren't. What they were trying to do, of course, was get round behind them, or at least get to a position where they could have some influence on the battle. They tended, once they met resistance, to either go away or not do anything, just sit and wait until a larger formation was coming along to give them support.
Thank you. We're moving on.
Yep. So hard to describe this other than an SS selfie. But having shown the two combat soldiers, here is a picture which is quite remarkable. Now, some suggest that this was painted by an SS artist in 1942 and put on display then. It's been on the books of many covers, and it's basically Sepp Dietrich, Gerhard Bremer, who looks like Adolf Hitler, who isn't, but it's Gerhard Bremer, and Kurt Meyer, known as Panzer Meyer, and all the others who got the Knight's Cross up until that point in 1942. Now, that's quite an interesting image of how the officer corps saw themselves as leaders. This heroic, they're playing that kind of heroic art picture, which you would expect that Adolf Hitler himself would probably paint, or the kind of paintings that he'd want to see in the Munich art gallery. after he threw out all the decadent art, you know, the Renoirs and all the great artists, he'd come along and have, you know, this load of old rubbish thrown in there. Now, the point of this is, it's not so much the fact that it's a horrible painting, and really it's just not very nice, actually. But it's actually how, if this is the case, that the SS leadership saw themselves in this way, it tells us a lot about them, how they stand, how they look, what's actually showing in their uniforms. I mean, I find it fascinating that a combat soldier would want to walk around with a cross right near his throat, advertising to all the snipers of the world, this is the place where you shoot me.
Yeah, shoot me there.
I've never quite understood that. Anyway, if we move on. Now, here's the contrast. So we know that the propaganda units are shifting with the Leibstandarte wherever it goes. That's a given. Gunter Dalquin, one of the famous Schwarzkopf editors, he's with them all the time. They're the place to be seen. If you're going to tell stories about the Waffen SS, you go with the Leibstandarte somewhere. And of course, you see the cameraman, the scribes, they're all there. But the one in the middle is Professor Peterson, and he's quite famous for these etchings. And his etchings are more of what I would call the ordinary man in performance of combat duties. And he's drawing a different image. And I think that image is the more, it's heroic, but it's also a depiction of how the SS ordinary soldiers, the ordinary men, see themselves as combat soldiers, picking up their comrades, standing there ready for action, fighting. There is this, the cannon fodder do actually fight. And a lot of people find that difficult to hear me say, because on the one hand, I've said they've not been very good soldiers, but on the other hand, here I'm saying they're fighting. Well, that's because in pure military terms, these guys know how to fight to a certain extent. They know that they can use their rifles, their machine guns when put up to a fight. But what's going to happen, and what's happening at this moment in time, is this new kind of division is emerging with new training, new combat men, and they're coming from training places that have been supported by the army. Yeah, this is the change. This is where the 1st SS Panzer Division virtually emerges and is different from what happened before. And a lot of people don't see that. They think, oh, it's the same family. Well, actually, there's a huge change.
Okay, thanks.
And you'll see it here. This is how the numbers are shifting. You see the large numbers. So from 1933, 117 men. So by 1941, it's already a brigade division with 9,700 men. By the time it got to November 1944, it's up to 14,000 men. And at periods before then, it's 18,000. And even, I believe at one stage, it was 21,000. But the break is when it starts becoming a brigade division in the latter part of Russia in 1941. You see that change, that shift is because Himmler's trying to expand the forces, but the other shift is the SS leadership within are saying, we've got to train these people. And we've got to train them properly. And what you actually find is those with some kind of combat experience are sent to Army General Staff colleges to learn how to perform in certain roles. You also see these soldiers being trained in field training by the same men at Bad Tolz and other SS recruiting centres and depots and training schools. So there is this shift taking place. So I know when I was talking about Peterson, I kind of jumped, but it's very difficult to gauge the jump. While the old core SS leadership are seeing themselves in the painting in the way they were, you've got this other new force coming through of what I would call a more realistic view of how the war is going to be fought. And it's all coinciding at the same time with Stalingrad.
Okay.
Yeah? So there's an awful lot of change taking place in the Leibstandarte story.
Thank you.
Now, in this change for academics and scholars who are writing about this, it's very difficult sometimes to understand all the details. And here's Mike Miller supplied me with ordinary men who were Knight's Cross, awarded the Knight's Cross for various combat. Now, you can't see it in the two red ink very well, but basically, this soldier's come into the Waffen SS from being a criminal policeman. He's gone through the ranks. He's been promoted to the first rank of the officer grouping. He's gone into combat. He's been awarded the Knight's Cross, and he's been killed. But all of that has happened in the space of 3 months. And in that process, he's not been processed. So his whole record is completely missing because they haven't had a chance with the rapid process of trying to get men to the front, get them fighting, get them promoted. So you're going through that churn. He has been missed by the system. Now, there are papers which then come later, especially when he's been killed, and they fill up the records to make sure everything is correct. But to begin with, he has actually been killed before the process could be completed. Yeah. Now, many of them are coming in and not getting anything but even an index card. So the large numbers of troops that are coming into the SS as an organization, but also into Leibstandarte, are just cannon fodder without any record. That's very hard for us to do social profiles of them, of any kind of accuracy. Okay, so if we move on. And as you can see, the level of losses is also having an impact on the transformation of the formation. So, you know, in Poland, it's suffering about 108 dead, France, 111, Balkans, maybe 10 officers, mostly if I recall. But by 1943 in the Soviet Union, you're in the thousands. Now, that is actually adding to the processing. Now, believe it or not, back in the day, when they first started, if someone was shot in the throat, the loved ones received a report saying he was shot in the throat. Now, with the large numbers and what's happened in Stalingrad and the fact that people's morale is declining because, you know, they've heard that their loved ones have died in the most horrific way, there's been a change. They get a letter saying, sadly, your loved one has passed, but the sheer volume of numbers that they're trying to cope with is rapidly increasing. And at the same time, what is not also understood with the Waffen SS is how much they're taking wounded. So you've had this new impulse of troops coming in. You've had the new training programs to make these men, make these formations better fighters. But at the same time, as they've gone into combat, they're now getting huge losses, which is swinging the system another way. And all of that has literally divorced the 1st SS Panzer Division going forward from the bodyguard unit that was raised in the 1920s. That was a separation point.
Okay, thanks.
I put 3 quotes up there because I think the final disintegration of the Leibstandarte takes place at the Falaise killing grounds in Normandy in 1944. Because what it does is it clears out virtually everybody who was around from the early days, and it has to be rebuilt. You know, I just put 1 soldier there because there isn't that much of a record to look at what happened. You actually have to go to a different source to discover what actually happened, what was the morale of these men, and what was their fighting condition. So if we move on to the next one, the prisoners of war went through the Allied interrogation.
Oh, have we lost Phil for a second? Phil, are you there? Phil seems to have frozen. We'll try and get Phil back in. Hopefully he'll come back in there, folks. While we're waiting for Phil to come back, it's a good point to mention, if you're not already a member of the channel, please consider being a member or becoming a patron. Oh, Phil's back, I think. There we are.
I don't know what happened there. I'm really sorry, but I don't.
It's fine. We just thought you were deep in thought for a few seconds.
Could have been. I had those moments. Anyway, so the prisoners who are taken in Normandy are put for a process by the Allied interrogators, and here you can see them coming to Kempton Park, or they went to New York. Now, the process was quite detailed, and we've heard all of the various stories of the different processes that have taken place, I'm sure, in the past. But the SS were identified, especially by the Americans, for some serious reporting. And if we go on to the next one, this is a summary of all the findings. So I was able to locate maybe 2,000 Leibstandarte men who had been captured or emplaced in that time, and a few obviously a bit later. But what it shows you is the origins of the division now, in terms of where the manpower was coming from, were German, Austrian, Volksdeutsche, Romanian, Hungarian, Polish, and there was 2 Englishmen in the division. One was a chap who came from South Africa, and another chap who came from London. They were made to be helpers, what they call heavies, and they were on the strength. And apparently Sepp Dietrichs met them, called them bone idle, then discovered that they were English and heavy, and then honoured them. What actually happened to them, we don't know. But you can see the numbers. Those numbers are shifting all the time. So you look at, you'd look at a reconnaissance unit within the SS division, and it's 85% German with some Austrians and Volksdeutsche. You can look at another detachment, and it's almost a third, German, Austrian, Volksdeutsche. But then you come across other units where there's a whole platoon which is Romanian or Hungarian. They're Volksdeutsche, but also known as Romanian and claiming to be Romanian and Hungarian. Obviously, there's a lot of contention about the Polish soldiers, all of whom wish to be redirected to the Polish army to fight against the Germans because they claim they were conscripted. The records that I found, they were all volunteers. So you're forever in that battle. Did they volunteer, or were they?
There's volunteer and there's volunteer, isn't it? I mean, it's impossible to work that out, isn't it? It's the yeah.
Well, the role is you're conscripted into the armed forces, and at the point of choice, you can say, well, actually, I want to fight for the Waffen SS. I mean, the classic example of all of that is Günter Grass, the famous German author. He wanted to be in the U-boats. He was conscripted. When he was called up, he had a choice, so he joined an SS Panzer Division. What's interesting about the period after 1943 is, as the Leibstandarte suffers these catastrophic losses, which are huge, especially in the winter fighting of 1943 to March 1944, it starts drawing on other units, troops from other branches of the Wehrmacht. So you see an awful lot of Luftwaffe men, Army, Navy, Police, and Reichsarbeitsdienst, the service troops. Now, those men, when they come in, don't sit very well often, and the diaries and the histories that the SS write about themselves often claim that there's friction between the Luftwaffe men, who are very proud, and the SS men who, quote, are very practical. And so you have a situation where it's often the SS squad leader, who's a junior NCO, has a ruckus with the Luftwaffe senior NCO, but magically they all come to a compromise and the system works. I, for one, don't believe it for a second. I think there was an awful lot of resentment that men who'd been in the Luftwaffe for a long time suddenly found themselves being forced to fight for the SS, who they were not impressed with. There was a lot of ill feeling, but you can only go with what what's there. What's very interesting is that the Luftwaffe and the army form large detachments. So you actually have whole units of the army serving within the Waffen SS. And sometimes what the Allied interrogators do is call them ordinary SS men, which is where I got the idea from. Because what they're saying is, well, they're not the traditional Nazi SS men, but we have to call them something, so we call them ordinary SS men. Which, if you look, then go if you then go to the Nazis and say, who are the Nazis in the 1st SS Panzer Division? German youth, 90% total. They believe to the very end that they're going to win the war and that they're going to be rescued by the fire brigade when they're captured. That doesn't alter for quite a while. The NCOs, maybe 80% Nazi. The officers, between 10 and 100%, depending if they're very cowardly or they're very brave. And it's quite interesting what that actually means, because pushing all of those ideas is the fear within many of the Waffen SS in Normandy is actually the idea that somehow the Allies are going to kill them when they capture them. Can't think why they get that idea. But anyway, the point is they feel that. And so as soon as they're captured, many of these younger Waffen SS men, especially the soldiers, will yap. So if you look on the record, the 1st SS guys who were captured not long after Oradour, when they were captured by the British, told the British that the Das Reich had committed the horrors at Oradour. So not only does it tell you that stories of war crimes transmitted between divisions and between units rapidly, but also when they were captured, they would be very quick to talk about those crimes as a means to try and scotch being treated badly themselves. If you look at the Luftwaffe now, so having said we're not Nazis and all the rest of it, nearly 50 to 80% of the Luftwaffe who joined the 1st SS Panzer Division show a high allegiance to the SS, to Hitler and the Nazi Party. Kriegsmarine often higher, but the army maybe not, depends. The interesting thing with all of those is it's the army NCOs are the most reluctant to surrender. They're the ones who try and fight to the end, and they're the ones who are the most reluctant at telling people anything. And so when the Allies are reporting them, they say, no, it's another one of those tough son of a bitch, you know, those tough NCOs. They won't say anything, but the others, look, they're very yappy.
Interesting.
So if we move on now. I thought because we haven't had a chance to talk about a battle, I would look at the Ardennes because it's December 44, so we're in December now. I've called it the short road to nowhere because the 1st SS was outstandingly useless in its probably the most bizarre performance, actually. If you look at it and you assess it in detail, they really do have a problem. And the fact that I put a soldier there reading a map is one of the things that I find quite remarkable. They are in the area where many of the panzer troops were trained in the 40s, and they don't know where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And wherever you are, basically just head west. I mean, is it? I'm a shit at navigating, but when you look at the Ardennes offensive, all the roads just basically go west, whether they're the logging tracks, trails, or the big roads. Just head west. Oh well, maybe I'm looking at it too simplistically.
Well, you never know. Let's move on.
Yeah.
So I know it's all a bit red inks and grass and what have you, but if you could draw a line from the furthest on the left, that's as far as Piper reached.
Yeah.
That's a place called Chevron. I can tell you now, it's the smallest village in the world to have captured. It's maybe a hamlet even. 3 buildings. on top of a hill surrounded by river. How he got there, even I find difficult, and I've traveled it many, many times. If we move on, I've focused here to show why the 1st SS Panzer Division now is completely wasted, and it's the impact of what's happened at Falaise. It can no longer conduct big battle. So I've called it micro battles. The SS and Germany could no longer conduct big battle. And so I focused on that area, which is in the red ink, and it's basically the push area. So what actually happens is the Volksgrenadiers are asked to break the line, and then Piper's column is to rush through and carry on until they reach Antwerp. But as I've said there, no plan survives contact with the enemy. That comes from Moltke. These are the roads and the assembly points. The two at the bottom are the assembly points where Piper's Tigers, Mark II Tigers stood, and the road above is the march routes of the 12th Volksgrenadiers as they tried to break the American lines. It's not often picked up, but the fact that those Americans held them up for 24 hours is significant. Yeah.
Was that the 28th Division?
No, I think the 28th Division was further down. This is the 99th and the 106th.
Oh, no. Yeah, okay, yeah, right, yeah.
Okay. Can we go on?
Yep.
So as you can see here, these are the 2 days. We're in a fractured battle space. You can see where they're trying to get through the lines on the top left side, 17th of December. They're still really not made any ground on the 18th. By the 18th, as far as everybody's concerned, as any rational person would consider, it's over. And you can see by looking at the 2 roads, on one road, you've got massive forest and hills to the right, and then to the left, you've got a river valley. You're going to march Tiger tanks down that road, hoping that you're not going to meet anything in the way, including the bridges being complete. The fact that the Americans blow up the bridges and offer resistance makes that task difficult. And if you look at the picture at the top right, that's leading up to Chenot. That's a small brew. They were caught in the open at one point, and the lead units were shot at by P-47 Thunderbolts. There's a story that Piper ran to a bunker there and dived in. I, for one, don't believe it. And it's certainly not in any of the combat diaries or reports and studies afterwards. If he did, fine. I don't believe he did. I think he went into the farmhouse and looked after himself for half an hour. Anyway, going up that brew, if you're in a Tiger traveling at probably 20 kilometers an hour, it's going to take you nearly 30 minutes to get up that hill. That is not good, because you've got a long way to go. You think it's just the hill looking up to the end of the trees. Actually, it turns round and then it goes back. So it's a wavy all the way up. Take forever. This whole thing is just complete nonsense. Anyway, move on. I've called it the illusions of mobility. And if you look at the bottom left picture on my screen, you've got Wilhelm Munker there, who was the commander of the division in the last days, in a traffic jam. I mean, how absurd is that? You can see them trying to get trucks down goat roads. You've got Sturmgeschütz on what appears to be a wide road. You put a Tiger down that road, it's not. They had this illusion of mobility, but there simply wasn't. If we move on. By the way, Pete Blanchard helped me with that, sort that one out.
Good old Pete.
Yeah, good to know. Propaganda was used by both sides in this fight. So as you can see, it's very interesting how the Americans go past the tank and then come back round again. There's an implication that that American soldier has shot 2 German soldiers on the ground there. And then, of course, as the Germans, as the Waffen SS start to surrender in large numbers, you can actually begin to see the dreadful condition these men are in. In some cases, they've been living in the cold for 7 days because it's taken them that long to march to their assembly areas. Then they've had to go out and onto the fight. Then they've been on the road for 2 or 3 days, and then suddenly bang. And they really are in no fit condition. And obviously their uniforms are in such a state. The whole story is sad, really. To think that we've got to a point where this great offensive, which everybody talks about, is really just some ragged affair.
Yeah.
So if we move on, the end, the banner, famously captured by the Russians in the occupation of Berlin. The 1st SS Panzer Division surrenders in the Austrian Alps, if I remember rightly. It ran from the Russians. The Americans, for some reason, allowed them to stay. They let other divisions go. They forced other divisions back to the Russians. Anyway, there we are. There's bits left, like the depot, which you saw before at Lichterfelde. There's still evidence. You can see where the main square was, where they marched out. I still remember there's one story in 43. The reserve battalion was marched out through those gates, taken all the way to the ballet, where the men were then asked to put on ballet tutus and leotards and form part of the stage. Yeah. Anyway,
Crazy.
So as a final act, there's the Tiger II outside the museum at L'Église, which is a fantastic museum. I recommend people to go and see. Is the artificial intelligence challenge, which I alluded to the other day. I've put 2 pages in just so people can see what I was rambling on about on the Christmas show. If we go to the first one, I hope you'll be able to read it. Why do you refer to an elite? I asked. So the artificial intelligence said the term elite regarding the 1st SS Panzer Division refers to the unit's reputation for being highly trained, well-equipped, composed of hand-picked personnel, etc. So if we carry on, I explained to them why it wasn't. What word better defines the 1st SS Panzer Division if we agree it wasn't an elite formation? And as you can see, the machine decides it's experienced or seasoned. I didn't prompt it to come out with all of this stuff. I didn't say you've got to say this, that, and the other. I just asked it a few questions. Yeah. And the app produced this. I put the whole lot will be going on Fallout so people can see it after this show. For me, that's a huge concern, because if you're running algorithms with all of this information coming in of, yes, it was a criminal organization, yes, it's an elite, or no, it's not an elite organization, and yes, it is a criminal organization, the algorithms are going to go in the end by weight.
Yeah.
And I think this is a serious threat to military history, because it's most obvious that it's the one place where denialists and others can do their thing. Anyway, I just wanted you to see. And as I say, all the content from this and everything else on the 1st SS Panzer Division, which I have, you'll be able to find on Fallout and Substack. And I've kept it to an hour.
Yeah, you're very good, very professional. It's almost like you've done this before. Well, I have a few questions before we finish things up, Phil. And I think questions stroke comments, really. And I think this language thing is so complicated, because when you were talking about the 1st SS in Normandy, because by then the Allies have any allied soldier who's come up against the SS in Tunisia or anywhere else, there's some knowledge about the type of soldier they are. And I'm being kind of careful with my words there, because I wrote down the words vicious, no mercy, and determined are the 3 words I wrote down, neither of which necessarily get across that a unit is very good at their job. They just say that you can be vicious and crap. You can have a vicious boxer who never wins a fight, can't you?
Yeah. I entirely agree with you. The problem of the language. Now, I didn't explain it. I left it to you whether you wanted to raise it in questions. I do not agree with the ordinary man thesis. I know that makes me seem odd, being a Holocaust historian and somebody who's been doing German history for a long time. I'm not an ordinary man thesis because I studied the police, the German police. And I can assure you there was nothing ordinary about the German police, especially after 1936, when they joined up with the SS. Although it's a reserve battalion of so-called middle-aged men, they were in a special case. And if you look at some of what happened in the court cases about the police, which Browning didn't cover, you can see that a lot of what went on was contrived because the police old boys were being treated kindly by the police new boys. And there's quite a story there. It's not perfect. For me, I tend to follow what Daniel Jonah Goldhagen thought, which is Germany's willing executioners. There is a period, for one reason or another, and this is my own thoughts on the subject, that men become, after a while, so politicized, they will conduct criminal orders, as has happened with Putin and in other conflicts around the world at the moment. The point being, when you try to categorize these people, as everybody does, because that's the way soldiers work, you categorize them as super formations, weak formations, green, dispersed. You come to the ordinary soldier. And at that point, you have a problem. Because not all of those soldiers, and especially if they'd come from the Luftwaffe or the army, if you've been conscripted in one branch and you end up in another, that doesn't necessarily make you a Nazi because you've ended up in that.
Yeah.
It's just you've been transferred by the system. And it then becomes a real problem of cataloguing and classifying and deciding whether at that moment in time it's a 100% Nazi organization or it's only 50%. And what's 50% mean? They only do 50% of the killings?
Yeah, I mean, David Levine said, in a question, are the SS stereotypes? No disrespect intended. And it's difficult because it's a large organization, comprising lots of different aspects, fighting in different areas. Some aren't even fighting. That, as you just said yourself, there encompass a whole range of levels of experience and abilities. I mean, you could probably say by 1944, if you're an Allied commando, you were probably elite, because I think that within individually there might be the odd guy underperforming. If you're an American parachute infantry regiment, you probably could be elite, I suppose. But the SS, it's an elite is the word that I get so stuck up on. And while you were talking, I've got two thesauruses open on my desktop, and one thesaurus has elite options. It's saying it's aristocratic, top drawer, top notch, top flight, upper class, world class. Another one is saying exceptional, superior, premium, prime, high grade, first class, outstanding. So two different thesauruses are giving two different definitions or synonyms for the word elite. And for me, that's the big, as soon as the word elite comes into a conversation, I find that's a metric that is, in World War II military history terms, so hard to put any kind of definition to. It's too loose.
If you take a sociological version, you can have a different perspective, because elites mean power,
exactly,
institutional roles, and so forth. The problem with the SS is you if you try to go down the route that of saying, well, they're just ordinary soldiers, you end up with the process of forgiving them, and saying, well, no, which is what Adenauer did. And his argument was, well, you can't throw the bathwater out and the baby. Well, you can if they're all criminal gits. The problem is that the trials against the SS always focused on certain aspects and steered away from others. And then they put in artificial levels after Germany became a federal republic and what have you, and said, well, if they were below level of colonel, then those SS men were not all guilty. Well, that's a problem thing as well, because Dillewanger was a colonel.
Yeah.
So you end up all over the place trying to place artificial levels and benchmarks of who these people were. And I noticed somebody saying, well, not all SS men were policemen. Well, the same can be said that not all policemen were the SS. But the fact that the two were married unto an organization and served each other for various ways changes the complexion of the policeman being just your general beat police, which of course they were.
I mean, Douglas Nash said it, I can't find the comment. He said something about the ability of the SS can be questioned in a military sense, but you're probably always going to have a fight on your hands if you come up against them. That's probably a fairly accurate point to put in there. They may not be good, but they're going to give you some kind of fight. Usually, is that fair? And from your interpretation?
Not from my interpretation, no. Okay. I think certain units, they do fight. And I think Douglas's units, they tend to fight.
Yeah.
I found that the Leibstandarte after 1944 was spending an awful lot of time running away.
Yeah. And yet, to bring it back to where, Normandy, which is obviously where I live, is that the British soldiers, veterans I have been meeting in Normandy for years, the American veterans, I mean, although the Americans didn't come up against the SS too often in Normandy, thank God, but the British and Canadians certainly did, is that they're definitely, when the SS comes up in a conversation, there's, those SS tank divisions, there's definitely a perception amongst veterans post-war that they were something different. Now, again, I'm being quite careful with my words. I'm not necessarily saying better, but different. There was definitely some, clearly because of the atrocities that we knew were committed by the 12th SS and others, there's definitely a different attitude among veterans about what the SS meant to fight, whether it's based on hardcore reality or kind of rumor in the battlefield or perceptions. And that has obviously overflowed into the kind of, we thought about this at the beginning of this show, the black and gold and silver books that have come out day in, day out about this. And I just saw it today on the Facebook. Someone just said, I don't know what it is. I just like the German tanks. They look cool. I know that's tanks, not bit. And I think we're always going to be stuck with the fact that there is an attraction somewhere that it shouldn't exist about the SS units to a certain type of person. I don't know why, but we're stuck with that, I think.
Yeah, and I can understand all of that. And, I had one in my family. He was a desert rat, 7th Farmer Division. One of his friends was badly murdered in Normandy in 1944. So, yeah, we all know those stories. But if you're going to get down to what the SS did as a performance, you actually have to look at the battle record and the fighting. And I find it very interesting that we'll spend all of this time, as has happened, with the Waffen SS, but we'll spend less time with the German army units. So, for instance, I particularly have an interest in the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion, which was the German Army's Tiger Battalion. And their performance is quite often outstanding. But if you look at the performance of the 501st SS Heavy Tank Battalion, which is, with the famous Wittmann and all of that, its performances are pretty ragged. And, you have to ask yourself, why was Wittmann in Villers Bocage doing his thing? Was it really him being brave, running out, trying to destroy the...
Just extraordinarily lucky, I would say.
British regiment, or was he doing something else? And my view is, after the headquarters of Panzer Group West was devastated, they couldn't use signals anymore, because it was allowing the Allies' air forces to target them. So Panzer Group West got absolutely flattened. So they all went into signal silence. Well, when the large panzer formations were placed into positions as to like a screen to prevent the Allies from coming through without being noticed. And the general frontage on a formation like Wittmann's was about 2 to 3 kilometers. So he's put in a line to see what's coming. And the 7th Armored Division just happened to come up the road. He engaged, but did he engage to stop them, or did he engage to get away so he could inform his bosses what happened? Now, notice after the tank gets whatever happened to it, and he jumps out the turret and runs away. He has to inform what he's seen, because they don't know. And that's a situation of what the Allies have done to the German forces in Normandy.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
They're not fighting efficiently. They're fighting reactively. Their reconnaissance battalions aren't strong enough to stand up to large Allied forces, especially the artillery. And you can't put silly armored cars in range of naval gunfire, because Fritz Witt, only a few days before, was blown up by naval gunfire, and he was a commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division. So you've got a huge problem of trying to fight a battle, on top of which you've got an incoherent strategy of what actually are you trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, we're going down another massive rabbit hole about the people's perceptions of the Normandy campaign, because we know there's that belief by some people that the British and Canadians, Americans were slow and ponderous and took ages to get out of Normandy, and they look at that map showing the 1st SS, all the other Panzer divisions south of Caen, and say, well, look, they were holding off the Allies for all that time, for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, whatever the hell it was. And yet the other way of looking at it is actually, no, the British and Americans and Canadians were building up a massive, great force of superior artillery, airfields they're building, a couple every week, blah, 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 blah. And they're going to move when they're good and ready to move on. And when they did move on, when you do get to Operation Totalize and Tractable, they kind of smash all that was ahead of them. I mean, and they had been attriting them even going back to Spring and Atlantic and Goodwood. So the thing is, ultimately, we're all stuck with these deeply entrenched beliefs that people have had for years and years, and it's about how campaigns were fought, and it's about how units are perceived. And I think we've chipped it away at this rock today, Phil. But I think there's a lot more of the rock below the surface that we're not going to be able to chip away at in one discussion on a YouTube channel. But we've done our bit, I think, Dr. Blood.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the one thing I would say about that Normandy thing is, if these divisions were elite, what condition were they in when they arrived in Aachen or the Aachen area?
Yeah.
Well, the 12th SS Panzer Division arrived with a tank and 1,500 men. Well, that's hardly an elite formation. Yeah. And the 1st SS was in such a ragged condition and was then put back into the line because they needed troops in Aachen to bolster what Oberst Wilk was being ordered to do. So they are in a mess. And if you read the General Staff reports for October the 25th, when they start reassembling the 1st SS Panzer Division, it needs almost 75% of every unit being rebuilt to get it into a condition where it can take part in the fight. Now, Montgomery has trashed the Panzer, the fire brigades, Hitler's fire brigade. He's actually trashed them. So all of those great Panzer divisions, which would have frightened the hell out of the Russians if they'd been in the Bagration area, have actually gone and faced Montgomery and have been trashed. And it's very interesting. In all the conversations I had with the SS guys, that Allied artillery, what it did to them, was never forgotten.
Yeah, I want to take you back to one thing you said right early on in the presentation about the art when the SS were kind of creating their own vision of the fact they always go back for their fallen comrades and they're very noble, they look after each other in the field, that kind of symbolism there, because I'm thinking that must be connected with the fact that already at that point they know they've got some big skeletons in their cupboard, literally in the case of what they've been doing in Poland and what have you. So are they already trying to not put on a front of how good they are as soldiers to cover up the fact that they themselves know they've been committing awful atrocities? I remember it's another terrible football analogy there. The fans from certain soccer hooligans, while they're busy beating people up, these groups, they would be explaining how, no, what we're doing is we're setting up civic pride. We're a group of people who come from a certain part of London, Liverpool, whatever. And what this is, we're creating a bond of stuff. They were finding reasons to justify their shitty behavior by focusing on the camaraderie there. So is that obviously a lot of the post-war reputation of the SS is all things, but they themselves are creating their own false image to cover up their shittiness. Is that fair?
to a certain extent. I think the problem with when you look at Peterson, I mean, I only stayed with the kind of work that he was doing, which was to show the ordinary SS man in combat. What he's not doing is making pictures of the murders and the killings. So, you know, on the one hand, they take, and I don't include it in the talk, but there's instances like the incident at Taganrog, where a motorcycle detachment is butchered by Russians, and then the SS boys go out on a killing spree and kill 4,000 Russians in reprisals. None of that is recorded, but they will film it and they will photograph it. So you have, on the one hand, this romantic art, and you have to remember in German thinking, there's this idea of, you know, pathos and sentimentality, and it runs very deep in German art anyway. And now you're seeing it especially so in this kind of false nonsense with Peterson and the Krause painting of the SS leadership. I think the thing that I would take from it is actually that they're all creating different identities: leadership identity, common soldier identity, and then somewhere around is the killing identity, where, you know, we actually say, or the SS actually say, we'll never tell this in the history books, and then proceed to go around telling everybody they've done all the killings. It's very odd. They say one thing and then do something else. They paint one picture and then display another.
I think you've hit on something quite masterful there, as you always do. That creation of different identities is exactly where we are now with people's interpretation of the SS. In that, if you're Dr. Waitman Bjorn or yourself a Holocaust historian, the vision the slice of the pie you see is atrocities, murder, brutal killings, fanaticism, and all that horrible stuff. If you're one of those people who is part of an SS reenactment group, what you're seeing is the quote unquote cool uniforms, the fast, swift, mobilized warfare, blah blah blah. And if you're another kind of historian, you're looking at another slightly different slice of the pie. It's all the same pie. It's you as an individual choosing which slice of the pie you want to look at. And I hope that most of the World War II viewers, World War II TV viewers, can understand that we can examine the SS as a fighting formation. Of course we can. We can even say that there are particular models of half-track that we prefer over other models of half-track, but we cannot ever not have that big slice of pie about their atrocities looming large in our understanding. That's where I am with this. It is a complex organization, and all of these elements are part of its story, but the different dimensions they're portraying, I think, is key to understanding this, or trying to.
Well, I mean, here's 2 points very quickly. Firstly, in this manuscript, I have a whole section on how they use killing, which is mass killing, shooting prisoners of war, as a means to reinforcing the fighting level of the soldiers. So they use blooding early on to force the soldiers into a form of behavior, which, if you like, they step over the barrier and they can go into the more extreme levels. Now, as you know, I've written this book, or I've been part of Chris Bellamy and the team who've written a book about Putin's war. And in there, I try to describe why we've foolishly made comments about the Russian forces, who, although they're a ragtag army with the Wagner gang and all the rest of it, they've managed to pull off some of the most horrendous genocide seen in Europe for a long, long time. And that genocide has bolstered those Russian forces, but it's done something else, which many people miss when they combine genocidal and murderous activities with military operations, and that is the domestic front. The domestic front supports Putin. They probably didn't within a week of the invasion, but they support him. Now, you look at what happens in the domestic arena of Germany during the war, when the Waffen SS is really pushing hard on aggressive, brutal warfare, and at the same time, the colleagues are rushing to get all the many Jews as possible murdered in the camps. The people in Germany are also becoming aggressive. And you see that with the lynching of Allied airmen. You see that with the pushing of denunciations against people of a strange, shall we say, relationships, gay people being outed, being taken to the Gestapo and then being murdered. So it's easy to say that this is just exceptional to the Waffen SS and it happened only in Germany, when actually you can see the same thing happening in Putin's Russia. And that is the military performance, whether good or bad. Sometimes it's been good, most of the time it's been bad. It's not stopped Putin from losing the strategic initiative, and it's pushed the Russian society to support him. And similar, the same thing was happening with Hitler. The one thing that's in the favor of the Allies is the Germans and Hitler were strategically stupid. I mean, that saved everybody. The fact that the guy was going off his head on all these wars and believing that he had fate. And that, of course, is another factor in the story of the first SS. They actually believe in the Führer. So if you think 90% of those boys are pure, hardcore Nazis, they believe in the Führer and they're going to win the war. So if they're captured or wounded, that's not a problem. We're going to win anyway.
Yeah. Well, now we're into the whole mindset of people believing and brainwashing. But that's another stuff another day. But Dr. Phil, we will leave it there, and we will schedule something else at some point in 2024. If I don't speak to you before the new year, have a good new year, my friend, and thank everybody for your fantastic comments and questions. And there's another show premiering, so not a live one. Alicia Callahan is talking about the 6th Armour tomorrow night. Then there'll be some myth busting on the evening of the 30th. Marty Morgan, Kevin Hemel, and someone else is on the evening of the 30th. I will remember who it is later on when I get those shows scheduled. But thank everybody for your comments, and I will speak to you all next time. Cheers, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Bye.
Happy New Year.